Okay, I think we'll get going. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Crunch 4.1. I hope we've all ready to go for this really fascinating conversation. We are aware it's a hugely topical discussion that we're going to be having this morning, and you have an illustrious lineup ready for you. I just wanted to say well done for making it through this last year. It's been a challenge for lots of people for lots of reasons, but we've made it. Let's all keep our fingers crossed for the 12th of April. And I don't really want to hold you up too much, but other to say, I hope you really do get involved. There is a Q&A, so please do ask questions of our panelists. That's what we're here for. And without further ado, I'm going to hand you to Ali Hanan of Creative Equals, who is very kindly moderating for us, but will also be offering her perspectives too along the way. Thank you, and over to you, Ali.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chloe. And yes, we've all made it through a whole year. All the good things to come. So a huge warm welcome from all of us and all of the panelists to everyone on the call today. This is just such an important topic, and so looking forward to this, exploring this with you all today. So truth and trust experienced a year like no other during 2020. Amidst great cultural change, readers sought out high quality journalism as the debate around fact or fake has absolutely intensified. Brands and agencies are increasingly focused on ethical ad funding, thank goodness. And now we live in a world where brands, agencies, employees, stakeholders, readers, and viewers are actively, not just passively, but actively inspecting their chosen media sources for purpose, for ethics, and for good practice. Absolutely critical, and it feels like it's absolutely critical to the world of publishing and business as well. So we have 3 goals for today, and the first goal is to really understand that line between what is quality news and what is fake news, and how that's being drawn. And the second goal is to really understand the cultural setting, the cultural context for what readers and viewers and listeners really want, and to really assess how publishers can build a better future for high quality journalism. And as a former journalist and a sub-editor and editor, I just think this topic is just so important. So we have an outstanding panel for you today, a stellar lineup. So give me a wave. Nic Newman, Senior Research Associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, no less. We've got Riyad Emeran, the Content Strategy Director at Dennis. Give us a wave. Good morning to you. We've got Anna-Sophie Harling, Managing Director of Europe at Newsguard. We've got Kemi Alemaru, Features Editor at Galdim. Give us a wave, Kemi, and good morning to you. And we've got Rebecca Coombs, the Head of Journalism at the BMJ. So Rebecca, give us a wave, and good morning to you all. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Nic Newman. So looking forward to hearing from you. And
thanks, Ali, and good morning, everybody. It's really good to be here. So at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, we've been working on many of these issues for a number of years with sort of public surveys, interviews, focus groups, to try and understand what it is people expect. And, is it true that nobody trusts the news these days? And I thought I would just kick off with a few slides and some evidence on some of these questions. So firstly, in terms of trust, yes, we have seen, a really big change in the last few years. So we ask a general question in our annual survey: to what extent do you trust most news most of the time? And you can see this fall in the UK from sort of 51% who agreed with that statement just before the 2016 referendum to just around 28% in 2020. It has actually did go up a little bit with coronavirus. And we also see similar movements in other countries. I've just put Germany and France there as a reference. So what's going on here? I mean, part of it is just, I think, a rise in skepticism. We just see so many different sources of news nowadays through social media, through the internet. We see different versions, slightly different versions of the truth. And that, I think, just makes us question things more. But we also see the impact of external events, of politics, of polarizing issues like Brexit, which has obviously affected trust in politicians. We know that, but also in the media, because people kind of see things on the media that they disagree with, on issues that they care, deeply and passionately about. I think there's also the question of, how far the media represents everybody anymore, or to what extent does it represent particular groups more than other groups? And this is actually the same question, just split by your political belief. So on the blue line is people who self-identify on the right, and the red line is people who self-identify on the left. And you can see here the sort of, there's always been a bit of a trust gap in the UK, where people on the right generally trust the media a bit more than people on the left. But you can see this incredibly sharp fall in trust after the December 2019 election amongst the left. So this is just a case where people feel that they treated Jeremy Corbyn unfairly. People on the left felt they treated Jeremy Corbyn unfairly. And that's just an example about politics. But these days, people, of course, feel passionately about all kinds of things, and they feel the media is being fair or unfair on a whole load of issues to do with social justice or inequality around how young people are treated. So you see, if you cut this data by young and old, you'd see a similar sort of trust gap, and also people from particular ethnic groups. So it's a kind of complicated area. The other area of trust that we look at is general trust in individual brands, and here we've asked people to rate brands on a scale of 1 to 10, and we've marked 6 to 10 as you trust the brand if you gave it a rating of 6 to 10, or 0 to 4 as you don't trust that brand. And despite what you read in the papers, there is actually still pretty good levels of trust in some of our long-standing broadcast brands like the BBC, ITV, Sky, Channel 4, also broadsheet newspapers. But you also see in the UK quite a lot of distrust, quite a lot of polarization with some of those newspaper brands like the Mail, the Mirror and the Sun, where you actually have more people who distrust those brands than trust them. And I think, the reason for showing this chart, I think it really illustrates the difficulty of, defining quality journalism, which I'm sure we're going to talk about more in the discussion. Many of the brands at the bottom here are obviously hugely popular, and people use them for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily about coronavirus news, so much as entertainment news or sports news, or robust opinion. People really enjoy the robust opinion, but they're not necessarily trusted, even by the people who use them. I think the other big change we've seen, the other big problem for traditional media, is that the media no longer has a monopoly over access to news. That's obvious, because distribution has changed so much. And this chart really just looks at the main way that people come across news these days. Where do they start their news journeys? And what we see in our data is that only around a quarter prefer to go directly to a news brand these days. So that strength of relationship has kind of weakened. Over half, this is for all countries, but actually the UK is pretty similar, now say that they start with search or social media. And this is, of course, is particularly true with younger people and for those with lower levels of education. So overall, we can say that most people are probably seeing a story that's been selected now by an algorithm rather than a journalist. And that's changed over the last sort of decade or so. And many of them, particularly younger people, now say social media is their main source of news, even though not that many people say that they trust the news that they find there. So what is the impact of all this? Defining we have declining trust in gatekeepers, we have increased use of social media. Not surprisingly, people are confused. So in the UK, around 2/3 of people, 63% in our UK poll, say they find it hard to tell the difference, what is true and what is fake on the internet when it comes to news. And a high proportion of those say they have seen misinformation in the last week. Political misinformation, of course, I mean, it's not necessarily made up stuff, but this is things that audiences feel is misinformation. It's their perceptions. But actually this year we've seen that overtaken for the first time by misinformation about coronavirus. And of course, these two are often linked. Also misinformation about celebrities, financial scams. I mean, there's a whole range of things that people worry about. So to sum up, people are trusting the news less for a variety of reasons. There's not one single reason. Increasingly, people are accessing news via social media and via search. The link with trusted brands has got weaker over time as we've moved to more digital consumption. And in those social networks, the news is often much more fragmented. Good sources are kind of mixed up with less reliable news, and people are often confused. And then on top of that, you've obviously had sort of bad actors playing on that confusion and the weakness of the social networks in sort of enforcing even their own rules. So I think we've reached a point where the whole industry, advertisers, journalists, technology companies, politicians, recognize that something needs to be done. They can't necessarily agree on what that is. So I'm sure we're going to come and talk about the potential solutions in the panel. But I think, fundamentally, what we have to do is to distinguish journalism again more clearly from the massive information on the internet. And there's sort of two parts of that. So one is it's down to news organizations to fix some of those things, some of those problems that have undermined trust over the last decades. So clickbait, agendas, really better delivering what it is that audiences want in terms of relevant and quality journalism. And then on the other hand, the industry also needs to work out, given how many people now access via these new technology platforms, which are fantastically convenient, on those platforms, how can we improve the quality of information? How can we get rid of some of the bad stuff? How can we promote some of the better stuff? And that's really hard. And I'm sure we're going to make some progress on that in the next hour. That's all I have. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. That was absolutely fascinating. And some of that data is quite deeply concerning, isn't it? And I guess the question is what to do now. And I think it's obviously been very interesting what's been going on in Australia with Facebook. I was going to say Facebook, with Facebook, and the access, of news through social media and what that really means. Okay, so passing over to you, Riyad, to hear your point of view. So looking forward to that, and hopefully some thinking and solutions coming out. It's a very worrying place that we're in, isn't it?
Hi there, Ali. Right, I'm just setting up a couple of slides, and I promised there are only a couple, and there's very little on them. And I've remembered to turn mute off, which is always a good thing. So everything you said about truth and trust, fact or fake, at the moment, or even over the past few years, massively important. We all know this. And the concept of quality is intertwined with that just completely, as Nick just touched on himself. But the question is, what is quality journalism? What is a quality story? So if you're a journalist, you'll generally fall back on the objective imperative that a quality story is well-researched, well-written, is backed up by corroborating sources, and has been fastidiously fact-checked prior to publication. We all like to believe that's what's important. But that's not necessarily what the consumers of media categorize as quality journalism, because the concept of quality is inescapably subjective. People want to believe that their own belief system, their own opinions are correct. And they will lean towards media outlets, they will lean towards stories that align with their own views and align with their own belief systems, or actually actively go out and search for that because they know they're right already. They just want to be told by someone else and have that kind of corroborated their opinion, and they certainly don't want someone telling them that they're wrong. So unfortunately, in the real world, the objective definition of quality journalism that we as journalists and media professionals like to cling to doesn't carry the weight that we wish it would, and ultimately that's a shame. So what does truth and trust mean? What do these things mean in a media perspective? So you'd like to think that one builds the other. You'd like to believe that if we reveal and report the truth the way the two guys in the previous slide did, breaking Watergate, we'd like to believe if you reveal the truth, if you give people the truth, that will build trust. It makes logical sense. But we're just not a logical species a lot of the time. Those logical steps don't always lead where we want them to do, want to lead. So while the truth is objectively a binary construct, things are either true or they're not true. Once again, the world sees things in a far more nuanced manner. Much like quality, truth is invariably viewed through that same subjective lens, which can lead to different conclusions. So a generally objective and logical person may look at the facts and derive the obvious truth behind them. But a far more subjective individual may look at the facts and reject them, refusing to derive that truth at all. But in most cases, it's far more nuanced. In most cases, the facts aren't rejected, but these people can find themselves interpreting those facts differently and coming to a different conclusion. Yeah, the facts are the same, but the outcome, the truth presented by those facts can be different. So if we look at last year's US election, for example, you know, the key facts, one of the key facts was that in some of the big swing states, Trump was ahead at the beginning, and then there was a huge amount of Biden votes, which essentially swung it the other way. Neither side of the argument really refuted those facts. They both accepted those facts, but they came to very different conclusions based on those facts. So the reality, the scenario was that, you know, mail-in voting, they weren't going to be counted until after the initial votes of the day. So we were expecting that to happen. But for the Trump supporters and the media supporting Trump, that was irrefutable proof of voter fraud, because how could Trump be ahead by so much and then suddenly not be? So while the facts weren't in dispute, the fact was, yeah, everyone was happy with the facts, maybe not happy, but everyone accepted the facts. But the truth that they wished to pull from those facts was very, very different. So while we can tell ourselves that truth will build trust, it can also have the opposite effect. You know, responsible media outlets reporting a truth that a group of people don't want to hear will build mistrust. They won't want to engage with that media, and they will look for outlets that tell them what they want to hear. But the question then is, well, how can a news outlet essentially give you that misinformation? How can they manipulate the facts to deliver their own agenda, whether it be political or otherwise? And a big part of that, especially in the US, is the fact that there is a very, very blurred line between news and opinion. And if you look at an outlet like Fox News, for instance, where the majority of what it broadcasts is actually opinion, they're able to hide behind that understanding that, oh no, we're not saying this is true, that's just that host's opinion. But the viewers of those outlets aren't seeing it that way. As far as they're concerned, you know, this is a channel with news in its title. You know, I'm watching the news. So you're in a position where that opinion, that blanket of opinion, is somehow hiding the fact that what's being broadcast and what's being disseminated and what's being amplified isn't actually the truth, but the people watching it, reading it, listening to it are accepting as that because it aligns with what they want to hear in the first place. But of course, all of that is just the tip of the iceberg. Once we look at social, once we start to look at the fact that with social media, there is no concept of regulation. There's no concept. There's nothing stopping anyone from saying anything they like, from spreading, amplifying whatever agenda they want. Essentially, social media has given the entire world a soapbox and a huge megaphone. And in some respects, that's fantastic, because it's the natural evolution of freedom of speech. It's the natural evolution of freedom of expression. Everyone has the right to express their own opinion. But there is a line, again, between freedom of speech and defamation. There is a line between freedom of speech and incitement. There's a line between freedom of speech and hate speech. And the problem with social media, as Nick just touched on, is that a lot of people are now looking to social media as the primary source of information, which is scary, because there is no regulation, there is no expectation of truth or quality on social media, but there is an almost higher belief in trust, because obviously the people in my social media feed are people I know, people I already trust. So when I see a video shared by someone calling them a doctor telling me that if I have a vaccine, it's going to, I don't know, make me trackable by, by the government for the rest of my life. Am I going to trust that more because it's coming from my friend that I've known since I was at school with? But of course, in reality, it hasn't come from him. It's been shared hundreds, if not thousands of times before that. But it's that sense of familiarity that builds that trust and again, makes people believe things that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have. I mean, social media is not going away, and it's, as we've seen, incredibly difficult to regulate. And it just makes the almost the system of quality of journalism, I wouldn't say it's unimportant, but it's less of an issue than it otherwise would be because social media is there. So truth and trust in journalism, massively important. Social media, arguably a bigger issue. And that's me.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, just a massive challenge, isn't it? When is it opinion? And when is it the news? And like you say, all the fact checking, you know, and rigor that goes into a great news story. You know, we know that that is at the heart of all the big publishing brands, and that is the massive challenge we have. Thank you so much. It was a really enlightening and brilliant conversation. So next up we have Anna Sophie. Could you?
Sure. Hi.
Are you ready?
Yep. Can you guys hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, wonderful. Great. So I'll quickly just share my screen. Great. Is that working?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. I feel like I should address the fact that I'm sitting in the dark. I'm currently in New York City, where it is shortly after 5 a.m. And the sun has not risen.
Good morning.
It looks like that. So I guess I am speaking about a problem that Nick lined up very eloquently before me, which is how do we help people distinguish between credible and non-credible sources and between the masses of different outlets they're encountering online. And he had highlighted something as well, which is that in part of the solution really is third-party labeling, and the labeling that we attach to different sources in the places where they're getting it online, which is search and social. So Newsguard was founded a couple of years ago exactly to address this problem. And I think it's worth noting, especially at a journalism event, that we weren't founded to help people distinguish between sort of the nitty-gritty differences of, you know, The Guardian versus the FT versus the Mirror versus the Times. Our core purpose really is to help people distinguish between websites that are run by journalists and have editorial standards and corrections policies, and I guess carry themselves with an underlying ethos of transparency and accountability when it comes to their journalism, helping people distinguish between that and the mass of websites that exists on social media and online that purport to do serious journalism but are instead driven by all sorts of different types of agendas, whether that is publishing outright disinformation to promote a certain political campaign or agenda, or that of a state actor, or it's simply to create articles that are so outrageous and clickbaity that they generate advertising revenue, or because, you know, they've noticed that if they quit their full-time jobs and sit in a basement and publish outrageous articles about Hillary Clinton, they can actually end up making more money through Facebook than they were making in their old job. So there are all sorts of reasons why people publish this information, and we can kind of get into that. But when we created Newsguards, it's important to know that we're also, everyone that works at Newsguard is a former journalist. We sat down and we said, okay, how can we create a set of criteria, both on the credibility and transparency side, that will help people to understand more about the websites that they're encountering online. And again, we rate not just only sort of all the major brands that you may have heard of, but we go out of our way to rate the credibility of local and regional newspapers, digital first websites, websites serving or covering different specific communities or topics, and then a whole range of blogs and many, many smaller websites. At the outbreak of COVID, we had also already rated a mass of websites publishing health and medical information, but over the last 12 months, we've really boosted those efforts to go out of our way to rate both green and red rated health and medical information websites. The primary way that people can currently access Newsguard is either by downloading a browser extension that we've built. We did not set out to be a B2C company. The idea was not that we would ever produce something that users would see. Instead, the idea is that in order for Newsguard to be put in the hands of the people who need it the most, i.e. those who are least served on the media literacy side, we hope over the course of the next couple of years to work with as many of the tech platforms as possible for them to integrate our ratings as a potential solution for users to opt in to see those ratings when they're online. So on the right, you'll see sort of the way that our browser extension currently works is that if you go onto Google and you encounter websites that we've rated, you'll see a little red or green icon next to that. You can put your mouse over it and read more about that source. And it works exactly the same way on a website like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, LinkedIn, you name it. Just really quickly, I just wanted to note that this is a study that came out a couple weeks ago. We're seeing, increasing amounts of research into the ways in which you can actually help to reduce misinformation. This study looked at the effect that labeling has on the behavior of people and whether or not that actually prompts them to think more critically about the sources they encounter online. And I think one thing I do want to highlight is that what they had found is that the results of their studies challenge the claim that people value partisanship over accuracy. And the research that we had done a couple of years ago with Gallup when we founded the Newsguard also sort of confirmed this, that people don't really want to be seen as publishing false information, especially if they know it's going to be labeled as such. And I think some of the results of the platform's own findings have found this as well. So to quickly talk about how we do what we do. It is an extremely manual and by all intents and purposes, the least efficient process in the world. We essentially run our own mini newsroom. This website actually came to us by someone who had sent it into us saying, I've just gotten a leaflet through my door that tells me not to take the vaccine. And at the bottom of the leaflet, it's telling me to go to this website. Can you guys rate it? So we rated it as quickly as possible and got the label up. And the way that we do so is teams of about 5 journalists will sit down, one person will draft it, goes to a first editor. The first editor will look to have a couple of questions. As this is happening, we also send a request for comment through email and phone to the website to make sure that we've gotten everything correct and to give them a chance to comment, which we then integrate into the label. And the website, the criteria that we use to analyze the websites are weighted differently. The most important one is whether or not the website repeatedly publishes false information. On this, we rely on the work of fact-checking organizations, but also our in-house team of editors and fact checkers who just take a look to see, is there verifiably false information on the website? And we list those examples in the credibility section. Gathering and presenting information responsibly is a more nebulous one. That can be anything. That is usually reserved for websites who have occasionally had major editorial mishaps, don't necessarily go out of their way to publish false news regularly, but a website can fail that criteria in a variety of ways. And then the remainder of the news and credibility, as the credibility criteria are, does the website have a robust corrections policy and does it actually publish corrections? Does it handle the difference between news and opinion responsibly? So for example, if the website does have a political bent or have a political leaning, like Huffington Post, do they disclose that? And do they clearly label news opinion articles as such? Or do articles in the news section have opinionated language. And again, in order to hold ourselves to account and to be as transparent as possible, in order to prove every single one of our red marks, we have to actually explain that in the credibility section. And it goes through several rounds of editors who all have different backgrounds in journalism and all have to be convinced that we've made a solid enough case to be able to go out of our way to say this website fails on this criteria. Sets of headlines is another one. And then on the transparency side, things like disclosing ownership and financing, labeling advertising, and providing information about content creators. And this, what you're looking at now, is what we call an attrition label. So we wanted to give people the option of seeing as much information about a news source so they're not wandering blind through social media and their search results. One more example I'll give is for a website that I really hope no one has encountered, but has gotten a shocking amount of traffic on social, newsroom24.co.uk, which is anonymously owned and run, and which is part of a scheme to promote holiday home rentals in Cornwall, England. And so this is basically just a marketing website, but it does publish outrageous and false information in order to gain traction on the web, and they've been very good at it. But we would not. This is, I guess, a great example of a website where they're not necessarily. This isn't like Russian government putting up a nefarious website. It's people in the UK, but because of the way that the social media algorithms promote and prioritize engagement and outrage over credible sources, means that something like this is bound to get a lot more engagement than many of the credible, trustworthy sources that we would normally rely on for credible information. I think the way that we've sort of thought about the internet versus pre-internet days is that Newsguard wouldn't exist if the algorithms on the internet didn't work the way that they did. I think in the old days, we would sort of walk into a newsstand and you'd see all the familiar names that sort of Times, Sun, Guardian, and you'd sort of over the years know and recognize what all these different brands were, and you sort of learn about them, and you'd see all the different headlines next to each other, and you'd know which ones you prefer and which ones you trust. And nowadays, it's kind of like walking into a newsstand or a corner shop, and the guy who runs the corner shop has taken all the newspapers that are in the front and put them in the very back and replaced the front with like all sorts of anti-vax pamphlets and marketing stuff and like just false information. And in that environment, users don't know who's behind those pamphlets. They don't know who's behind the leaflets, and because it's the thing that they're encountering day after day that's being shared to them by their trusted newsstand guy, they have to actually wade through quite a lot of stuff to make it to the credible stuff. I think that's really the problem that Newsguard is trying to address. We wish we didn't have to exist. And we also, I think it's worth noting, don't think that, we don't see ourselves or want to be the ultimate authority on what is credible and what isn't. In our ideal world, there would be like 10 different Newsguards. All of them would be integrated into social media and search, and people could decide for themselves which ones they trusted the most. I guess I'll stop there.
Wow, that is absolutely just so impressive. I obviously have known about the tool, but not in that level of detail. And I think that is just, it feels like an absolute or almost essential extension that everybody should have. So, yeah, incredible work. I'm going to ask all the listeners or on the call to just think of any questions you've got for our panelists as we go through. We will be taking a Q&A at the end. So already seen a question from Simon Entwistle in the chat box. So looking forward to picking up that at the end. But any questions as you go along, any thoughts, any reflections, we'd just really love to hear from you, because it's just important to hear your voices in this discussion as well, and any reflections you have as we go through. Yeah, that was absolutely just fascinating. So Kemi, over to you now. It'd be so interesting to hear it from your point of view as a features editor at Galden.
First of all, I did not prepare a slide, so you're just going to have to look at my face, unfortunately. I'll just continue and be animated enough so that the slides, you know, are by the by. I really loved, Anna, that you were talking about, you know, this topic from the point of view of an organization who's set up to correct the dismal trajectory of the media, because that's kind of Galdem's bread and butter. You know, not just from fake news and, you know, social media's impact on the lack of truth and trust in journalism, but also just the other huge failings that have existed without social media and have existed before social media existed. Mostly that marginalized people have been sounding the alarm on the failings of the press for a very long time. So Galdem as an organization is run by women and non-binary people of color, mostly UK based, but we commission worldwide. And it kind of was born out of just a dire need. It was one of those things where when I first heard about Galdem, I was just like, of course, this is exactly like what we've needed. And of course, this is exactly the sort of publication that I want to see and that I want to read. We were all sort of making our way in the journalism field and would often find ourselves as the only ones in the room, or, you know, sort of powerless to challenge certain headlines that editors would put forward if you were in an internship, or even just to a certain extent thinking of where you're going to work. Like, could I have knowingly like applied for the Daily Mail, knowing how like horrible the Daily Mail headlines, you know, make you feel when you are a person of color? And it was just that sort of moment where we were all not jaded enough to just think of the solution and just go for it in a sort of DIY fashion in our early 20s. I'm only mid-20s now, but it just feels like we are, feels like we've really gone through the wars already. But the things that we were set up to challenge are certain things like there was a Comres survey in the UK that found that 23% of young people blame the media for things like Islamophobia. And, you know, there are constantly headlines like 4,000 foreign murderers and rapists we can't throw out. Immigrants bring more crime, migrants spark housing crisis. But even, you know, going back to the Sun in the 80s talking about the gay plague, there are headlines that feel pointed at you when you're a minority voice, and you don't necessarily have the tools to fight back or to speak back, because in the UK, for example, I represent just 0.2% of journalists who are Black, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. So it's a skewed vision, it's a skewed landscape. We're really talking about leveling the playing field because there are kind of dominant voices that are heard and dominant viewpoints that kind of set the narrative. But you know, we need publications to counter that, and we need different viewpoints just for, you know, a healthy society. Some further like analysis on the reporting of minorities is Harvard University found that 7 out of 10 stories of young Black men relate to some form of crime. And these things might seem surprising when you hear the stat, but if you think about it, it's not that surprising. If you read newspapers, if you watch the news, how often do you actually see positive stories about these groups of people, and stories where we aren't a problem or an issue that needs to be solved, where we're just humans that also contribute to society? And when you think about where we are right now politically, in this country and further afield, it's not really surprising that there is so much tension, because there's a very narrow view of especially racial minorities, but, you know, right the way through to people's sexual orientation. And this is something that over time has completely decimated the trust among those communities. Sort of before people were talking about fake news, the news about us was nowhere near close to the truth that we were living. And that's a trust that we're trying to build up with GALDEM. So in the last year, we have kind of started to think about, what's the long-term plan? This is no longer something we just do from our bedrooms or after uni or after work. This is, our mission, and how do we make it sustainable in a landscape that is so like every day there are news stories about journalists losing jobs. So we've not only sought investment and now work with brands for advertising, but we also launched a membership model, which I think kind of reflects the trust that people have in GALDEM. That in under a year, we've had almost 3,000 members sign up to regularly give us money each month to keep doing what we're doing. I think that shows that there is an appetite for another viewpoint that is inclusive and empathetic to communities who don't have a voice. It's important to distinguish that we're not a newspaper, we are a magazine. You're not really coming to us at 10 a.m. for headlines and breaking news. That's not really what we're in the business of, mostly because we just don't have the capacity for that. We did experiment for a while with news, but you just end up aggregating other people's stories. And I think what people kind of want from us, and you can see this in a digital first company, you can see that like people come to us for a slower reflection of what's going on. They come to us for our views and analysis on the main stories of the week, from politics to culture, and they kind of want the GALDEM angle because that's something that is missing elsewhere. So it's not just seeing that there is news of a lockdown, or that there's news of coronavirus deaths being really prevalent in our communities. It's looking at, okay, what does lockdown mean for working class Asian people and Black people who work in taxis and supermarkets? What does this lockdown look like for us? Is it just that we're baking bread, or are we actually like putting our lives on the line? And when you're looking at the figures to do with, deaths in the community, it's sort of like holding each other's hands and being like, we're seeing these headlines, but not really having the sort of human element of like, how does this feel as a community to like know that we're at risk, and what's increasing those risks, and how can we help each other? These are the sorts of like approaches to the news that you're not really going to get in the Telegraph, for example. That sort of feeling of holding the community, because it's not just an outlet for information, it's sort of an outlet for solidarity also. So one of the things that came up in our preparation calls was the idea of us reflecting and leading opinion responsibly. And it's not that we publish divisive opinion in an inflammatory sense just for the sake of it, for clicks. I think the internet did go through that stage, especially around like 2016 when we were born, where saying the most outrageous thing the loudest was really beneficial for you as a company, because the clicks would just roll in and the shares would just roll in. But when we're talking about contributing to a conversation, it's thinking, how do we say something that's missing from the mainstream narrative? And how do we include voices and viewpoints that speak to the concerns or needs of our community? And we really try and set the tone of certain conversations and in the framing of big news stories, particularly when they've spun out of control. So with the Naga Munchetty story, where she was penalized for, just kind of talking about racism from her own perspective as a woman of color. She was demonized for that by a lot of publications and a lot of people on social media, where people feel very brave to be loud. But while we believe that, you know, nuance is really important in journalism, you just shouldn't take a neutral stance on oppression. It's not up for debate, and it's not up for discussion whether she, you know, should have said it or not. If that's something that she experiences, it's not a mad slant that will take away from the legitimacy of her work to just talk about the fact of racism. And setting the tone of conversation can sometimes be quite playful with things like the Labour leadership right now. We aren't happy, and like a lot of people aren't happy, and so we won't mince our words. Like publishing something saying that Keir Starmer is a wet wipe as the headline, it's funny. It doesn't mean that it takes away from our journalism, because in there we have cold hard facts, and we have, you know, an honest, nuanced reflection of his time as Labour leader. But the tone is of that of a friend, or that of, you know, somebody who's just on the same level as you, and we're not trying to like we are sort of preaching to the choir, which gives us a bit of flexibility in how we frame our work, and that does allow us to have a more youthful tone of voice when it comes to things like that. But it doesn't mean that we take our journalism any less seriously. There are still standards. We still fact check. We still need people to quote their sources. We still have people sub the work. We, you know, each editor has a range of experience, but at the end of the day, we want to be mouthpiece for what people are thinking. And if we're absolutely sick of Keir Starmer, then we are not afraid to really say how and why, and have fun with that. And so when we're talking about the principles and approach of GALDEM and for our community, I think our connection with our readers is really, really paramount. We take a people first approach to journalism, because that's what journalism is. It's stories about people, and people will be reading the stories. So how can you be inclusive with the content and the tone and the information that you're putting forward? And that's not just a cosmetic brand image thing, as diversity and representation can often become at the minute. It's not just that we have an assortment of identities evident on our Instagram so that we look like we're walking the walk. It's really building that into the fabric of the company, because media companies, they don't just publish articles, they work with brands, and the brands that you work with, that can impact the trust, especially for us. If we, you know, did a project with Nestle, who have a bad rap among our readers, that starts to make them question what our political viewpoint is. So for us to maintain trust, it has to go right the way through everything that we do as a company in our hiring processes. We recently undertook training to better serve disabled communities, not just writing about disabled communities, but also thinking of asking writers about their access needs to assist them in telling their own stories. And it's just like constantly reminding ourselves of, you know, who's not in the room, who should be in the room, how do we make this room work for them, and what will that do to our storytelling? And I think it makes for a website that is unlike many others on the internet. It's a space that feels unique, and it feels different. And in the last year, the growth that we're seeing as we're putting in, you know, our full-time hours, there's a need and there's an appetite for it. Yeah, in terms of who we're not hearing from, that's, you know, one of the key tenets of GALDEM, but also looking at the subterranean layers beneath the stories that we are reading is really, really important. If we're talking about, you know, fake news or post-truth, the loudest voices, places like the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, we have to unpick why they're saying what they're saying, why you're reading what you're reading, and what the more balanced view is from our perspective of inflammatory stories that occur elsewhere. So how is the wider cultural context of post-truth affecting our everyday? I think it's important to acknowledge that the environment of this sort of post-truth content world and ideology seems to paint people like us as the enemy. Women, people of color, the queer community, you know, non-binary people, transgender people, feel very attacked and very unsafe, and that's just putting it lightly. It's quite frankly a terrible time. So the way that it's affecting our everyday is just that we need to keep ourselves as a voice to advocate for silenced communities. We need to keep the business going. We need to keep the publication flourishing, because, you know, it can't just be that we have like a wholly right-wing press, a sinking left-wing press, racist press, but no anti-racist press. Like, there needs to be a balance so that the country and the world feels balanced. And very recently, reporting on the discourse around the Sarah Everin vigil, for example, pretty quickly a narrative came about painting attendees in a certain light while we were on the ground standing in solidarity there. Groups like Sisters Uncut, we have you know, a long-standing relationship with them. So standing in solidarity and being a loud voice against women's violence is something that we have been doing from the outset. So much so that organizers, you know, at the rally were talking about GALDEM as one of the outlets that, one of the only outlets that covered the movement with any truth. And I think the crowd whooped. And it's really key for us to feel like we're mobilizing our readers and that we're part of the change that we want to see. It's not just that we want to sit in our bedrooms and, you know, get lots of brand sponsorship and fat in our pockets. Like, GALDEM has a real ideology and a real vision for like what we can achieve beyond just, you know, being information. Like, our information has an end goal, and we have an end goal for the sort of change that we want to implement. So I think our whole business structure, our whole organization is set up to counteract post-truth, and hopefully we are chipping away at that bit by bit with our work. And that's all I had to say.
That's all you have to say? Oh my goodness.
That's all I had to say.
That's incredible. I think it's just so interesting that, you know, there's a you know, the phrase, who makes the work shapes the work. And can I just double check that you said that 0.2% of journalists are Black journalists? Can I? That's
the last figure that we had, was 0.2%, yes, which is tiny. It's tiny, and it's lonely to see one of the only voices in a news that's trying to, you know, convince editors that certain stories are worth covering, or that there's certain language that you should and shouldn't use, or maybe the image on that maybe doesn't work as well. Like, it's kind of it's a lonely place to be the only one advocating, and to spend your whole job advocating when that might not necessarily be why you got into journalism, is to fight on behalf of, you know, people who are like you. But as soon as you get into it, it does become a major part of the role, whether you like it or not.
Oh, thank you for everything that you've shared. And I think, you know, just also a brilliant point about the responsibility of, you know, it's interesting to hear about your relationship with advertisers as well, and how, you know, what kind of advertisers and brands are supporting and thinking about where their content goes, but also for you as a publisher, thinking about what advertisers that you want to align with as well. I thought that everything about that was just, your story was absolutely fascinating. I'm just conscious of time. So over to you now, Rebecca. Rebecca is
Hi.
Hi. Hi. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'm Rebecca Coombs. I'm head of journalism at the BMJ, and I really enjoyed what you were saying, Kemi, actually. I absolutely agree about being the change you want to see, and how ridiculously undiverse journalism is. At the moment at the BMJ, we're in talks with the Journalism Diversity Fund, which is a great organisation which you can contribute to as a company, and then you can sponsor student journalists through their NCTJ course, and that's one of the ways that we're looking at sort of changing what we do anyway. Anyway, thanks very much for inviting me here. As I said, I'm head of journalism at the BMJ. I haven't got any slides either. I'm responsible for all our journalism at the BMJ, including investigations. For those of you who don't know, the BMJ is one of the world's oldest and best known medical journals. So we've got offices here, but also North America, South Asia, and China. As well as publishing research, we publish clinical reviews and comment, but we're unique among medical journals for investing in journalism. And our stories regularly become mainstream news. So, you know, we've been on the front page of the New York Times and all the sort of British dailies and throughout some global news. And one of our hallmarks has been a commitment to invest in sort of take no prisoners investigations, where we challenge vested interests in medicine and drug industry. And this focus seems particularly important at this time of faltering public confidence in fact and truth. I just want to talk about that with in relation to the BMJ and COVID in our last year, and how we've sort of had to hold on very tight to those kind of those values, if you like. And we've been publishing since 1840, but even with this wealth of historical hindsight, COVID has been a time of high challenge, hard work, and extraordinary ways of working. Our normal practice has sort of been overturned. The public was learning of things in the general press way before it made its way through peer review and scientific literature. And as the pandemic unfolded, our readers were desperate for reliable information about this new viral disease, about which literally nothing was known. So the early days of the pandemic was marked by sort of high uncertainty about the natural history of the disease and emerging treatments. But of course, it didn't stop a kind of outpouring of seemingly definitive health messages, completely unsupported by proven science. So just as an example, early on Saturday, the 14th of March, the French health minister tweeted that people with suspected COVID-19 should avoid anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and instead take paracetamol. And you know, this wasn't, you know, the finding of one of the large sort of platform trials that are going on at the moment. This was, his comments seemed to stem in part from remarks attributed to an infectious disease doctor in Southeast France. And her comments came from 4 cases of young patients that she was treated. So it's, you know, it's a dangerous way of communicating information, particularly as it's unproven information. But it's unfortunately, it's the way it is in a fast-moving situation like COVID-19. And I think we saw it as our role as journalists to take what scientists were talking about and turning it into information that could be understood. And I suppose that's what the BMJ has always strived to do. But with COVID-19, suddenly every newsroom in the world was chasing the stories that are our bread and butter. And we had to figure out where our power was, you know, how we could add value to the massive information that was coming out. And so our challenge was to communicate complex and rapidly changing information and making sure the right messages got through. So I'll just quickly go through 3 ways we did this. So number 1, we needed to be able to tell doctors what evidence is out there and what is known about how to treat COVID. Just going back to what Nic said at the beginning about the importance of differentiating journalism from the massive information that's published online. So, you know, it's the obvious stuff. It's properly sourced, it's fact-checked, and it's led by facts. And at the BMJ, our journalists have adopted some of the conventions of research publication. So we peer review, which is where you would send an article out to a group of experts who are specialists in that area, and they will very honestly comment. They will do sense checks, adduce that all the evidence that we're using is correct. Occasionally we use freelance fact checkers, and actually I think we're going to be doing a lot more of that in the future, when we're even looking at employing a fact checker, a full-time fact checker. We always get a second read from a fellow editor before sending to the subs. And we also seek reviews from statisticians. And we also show our workings. So we think it engenders trust for readers to see that an article has been peer reviewed or actively commissioned. So it will say that on the piece. So we're not just passively accepting content from people. We're out there commissioning, we're working as active editors. And there's an ongoing conversation between the journalism team and the research and education teams about methods and approaches. And we're often expected to reach the same standard in fact checking and verification with our journalism as we do with our clinical research. So we have very good networks amongst working clinicians and academics to fact check stuff. And to be able to do this, we doubled the number of clinical news stories last year and increased the number of our features by more than 60%. Secondly, we're keen to be authoritative. We want people to be able to refer to us as a source of reliable, trustworthy information. And as I said before, our readers were desperate for reliable information, and the BMJ decided early on to lift our paywall so that money should be no barrier to accessing pandemic-related information. We launched an online landing page, so all our COVID-related content was hosted free of charge. So this made it possible for our users around the world, especially hard-pressed clinicians, to keep on top of the emerging evidence. But what was interesting is with our paywall down, we were suddenly welcoming a massive new readers to our site. And we felt as journalists that we could, for the first time, extend our reach to the public. I mean, my husband works at the BBC, and I'm always really jealous about their reach, the kind of millions of people that will come and read a digital explainer. And we didn't really have that reach, but we will regularly get 20,000 page views on our article, but with lifting our paywall, that was going up sort of fivefold. And we had a 84% increase in new users in 2020 compared to 2019. So search, email, social media referrals were a large proportion of our referrals. And what we did is we focused on answering questions people wanted to know about and doing it very specifically and well. So, for example, explainers on what is the evidence for cloth masks, what treatments are being investigated for COVID. How is the UK using lateral flow tests in a pandemic? And we sort of felt we were sort of rewarded in that, we felt suddenly more people were finding us through Google search. So BMJ traffic, just for our journalism, our unique page views were up sort of 67% compared to the previous year. And last year, our usage increased from 29 million visits in 2019 to 43 million visits in 2020. I think also we had to cope with the fact that we're still learning how best to respond to COVID-19. So, and that the evidence is still emerging and being debated. And I think you have to, I think this is really important with truth and trustworthiness, is that you have to deal with uncertainty, and we didn't try and avoid or deny that. And we looked to ensure that we reflected where there is uncertainty and debate, and we've got a thriving community of doctors posting rapid responses to our content, as well as BMJ opinion pieces, and those are very clearly labelled. And I just wanted to quote George Davey Smith, who's a clinical epidemiologist in Bristol and who wrote for us, and he said that acknowledging uncertainty a little more might improve not only the atmosphere, the debate and the science, but also public trust. So, if we publicly bet the reputational ranch on one answer, how open-minded can we be when the evidence changes? So we did spend a lot of time covering data around the limits of evidence around some interventions, especially around lateral flow testing. Does it really do what the government says it does? And at the same time, we have looked at the fact that decisions, they just had to be made with the evidence that was available last year, because we were moving really rapidly. People were dying. So however imperfect the evidence is, sometimes you just had to make a decision. But it's a debate that's played out in our pages. I just wanted to touch on false balance as well. So there's a real challenge in ensuring we cover real debates between informed experts rather than simply views held by a vocal minority within the medical community. And we try very hard not to fall into the trap of presenting false balance in issues where science simply isn't anywhere near anywhere near balanced. And just looking to the future, I think that, what we've learned is we just need to bridge that gap between science, the media and the public. During COVID, it was very difficult for news reporters to get hard facts at times. The government really wasn't very good. I mean, there were 6 different government agencies that we were dealing with. No one quite knew who was in charge of this pandemic response. Was it Matt Hancock? Was it Boris Johnson? Was it Chris Whitty? We also had this kind of drip of information from drug companies. So, scientific findings are usually reported in journal papers. They're peer reviewed, they're hand selected by the journal's team of research editors and statisticians. But in COVID-19, that it just completely disrupted science and sort of transformed research publishing. There's a huge rise in research submission and fast track publication. It fueled a sharp rise in sharing through preprints. So these are kind of like the raw copy of a research paper. So it's an article that's posted online before peer review. And a lot of drug companies were getting out their results through that means. In fact, one of our reporters, she was covering the rollout of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine in South Africa, and it had been paused after a study in 2,000 healthy and young volunteers that reported that because it didn't protect against the new South African variant. But, the study, nobody had seen it apart from the Financial Times, and we were being asked to report on it. So we'd gone from reporting usually our usual standards to report on published studies, and then we were suddenly reporting on preprints, and then we were just reporting on press releases because that's all we had. And then this was the kind of the very thin end of the wedge because it was sort of top lines exclusively seen by a news outlet. So the details were so lacking. We didn't even have general numbers. And I just wanted to quote Elizabeth. She said, I seem to spend a lot of time at the moment adding important context and caveats to headlines from other outlets, and journalists need to be responsible and not just chase clicks. And press offices and institutions need to be more transparent. So we all have a role to play. There's a lot more that I could say, but I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
I love what you were just saying about chasing clicks, and I guess it's actually quite worrying hearing some of the things that you've been saying about no one knowing who's in at the government. That is actually quite, a worrying thing to be hearing. But really fascinating to hear about your role, and I think it's so important more than ever, particularly with all the furore around the AstraZeneca vaccine. Mm-hmm. That's just being, just really people are very confused about whether it's safe, not safe. So I think, I'm sure.
And it is confusing, and I think part of that is to do with the way the drug company has been rolling out its findings. I mean, you can't blame journalists in that respect, I think. I'm not saying that we're wonderful. I think it is quite difficult, actually.
Mm-hmm. Really challenging. Right, well, we've now got like just 10, 15 minutes for Q&A, and we've got some great questions. I'm going to go to a question from Simon Entwistle, which I think would be good for you, Nic, actually, thinking about some of the things you talked about. But if anyone else would like to pick up on it, please put your hand up. And his question is to what extent has the messaging of political figures such as Trump, Bolsonaro and Erdogan created new challenges to news journalists? Because when you have some of the leaders of the world saying that this is fake news, what is the impact back on the world of journalism? Any thinking from you, Nic?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously that's not helped. And we've talked about misinformation. It's very complicated, but it's clear that some of the trust figures that I was showing, certainly in countries like the United States, amongst Trump supporters are much lower. And part of that is the sort of consistent narrative and the way in which Trump in particular has used social media to push certain narratives. And again, this is not necessarily classic fake news with sort of stories from Macedonian, content farms. This is something different. This is essentially, the politician, sometimes with a grain of truth, but sort of pushing a false narrative. And so that's, the way in which politicians have, if you like, weaponized social media and the internet has been a big part of the problem. I mean, and if you think back, we had this incredibly optimistic sense about social media until about 2016. You know, it was going to provide news perspectives. It was going to provide more diverse voices. You know, the social media and the internet has enabled, you know, media brands like Galdem to find an audience and to distribute content. So there's been a lot of positives. I think what we've seen recently is a whole load of people, you know, trying to use, powerful people quite often trying to use these networks to get their own messages across, and that has undermined trust. Equally,
them saying, well, that'll be the Trump saying all the time, well, that'll be the fake news media.
Sure, and Erdogan in Turkey and Bolsonaro in Brazil, yeah, and they've copied each other.
Yeah. Anyone else like to share their thoughts on the topic, Riyad?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump's a really great example, because whether it was intentional or not, the first 2 years of his administration essentially telling his entire base not to believe the media had a huge impact on the way the COVID response was dealt with, because essentially the media has a really important job in times of turmoil, like as with the pandemic, because that is the place where we as citizens are supposed to find out what do we believe, what do we need to do. But you essentially had a situation where 70 million people had been told to ignore that. So there was no stories, there was no reporting, there was no fact-based journalism about the pandemic and what people needed to do, that Trump's base wasn't happy to ignore, because they had been indoctrinated to do so. And, you know, the media stopped being able to do the important job it's historically always done. And I think that was, you know, hugely damaging, but also hugely indicative of the polarized society we're now living in.
Rebecca?
And I was just going to add, I think it's it gets worse, doesn't it, in times of emergency. So I think it's when particularly fraught and kind of authoritarian states eager to control the narrative, particularly at times like we're seeing COVID-19. So you've got a range of leaders who, you know, touting unverified information about bleach cures, to those, you know, repressing crucial information, as we saw in China. When, you know, there was that doctor, wasn't there, who sort of sounded the clarion call through a social media post warning about a dangerous virus, and there was immediately shut down.
Fascinating. I think it's it's such a huge challenge, isn't it, when you've got leaders of the free world actually actively dismissing the news. I'm going to move to another question, and actually this is a very specific one for Anna Sophie. The question is, what is the difference between Newsguard and Our News? It seems to me the two overlap a lot. Is there any chance you could collaborate? I'm worried that competing actors in the field of trust in news can further fragment public trust, as people may be asking themselves which company they trust more. I think it's, you know, just a very specific but quite poignant question. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good one. I mean, the industry for companies and organizations that are trying to do what we do is quite small at the moment. So we all know each other, and I know Richard Zach, the guy who runs Our News, fairly well. We cross paths. So I guess to answer the first part of the question is, so their approach is they have also a browser extension. I think they call theirs like a newstrition label. So yeah, there are a lot of overlaps. But what they do is they aggregate information and data from a couple of different sources, which they present. And then they also use machine learning to scrape some of the metadata of articles to give people information about the credibility of the source, and also at the article level. So I think the difference is they also rate, I think, individual journalists in addition to the news outlet. Whereas what Newsguard does is, you know, all we do is provide a single rating at the source level rather than for the individual journalist. You know, different approaches. But I guess the main question here is whether or not all the different efforts should collaborate and produce one tool and produce a kind of the thing that we always get pushback on, which is, should there be a ministry of truth? Or should it be a competitive environment where you have a couple of different companies who have different approaches? And in the same way that, we have this for every single part of the tech industry, right? We don't have just one music player and one social media platform. And, it's, when it comes to truth and trust, I guess I would almost say that people are probably more likely to just want to survey the landscape of third-party companies making products like ours and then decide which they like the most. Maybe it's a combination, maybe it's just one. Then have all of us collaborate to produce a single tool that has a single authoritative rating. It's also worth noting, that there's a lot of attention focused on approaches like Newsguard's and those of our competitors. And we do get a lot of pushback and I totally understand that journalists were originally very skeptical of the idea of anyone coming in and rating their content. Completely get that. And I think that's a very fair argument. No one likes to be rated. But the most important credibility ratings that exist currently are those within Facebook, Google, Twitter, TikTok. All the big tech platforms have their own version of what Newsguard does. It's just in-house, entirely unaccountable, non-transparent, and a combination of in-house content moderators and whatever their algorithm has decided that news outlet deserves. And if you're, Galdem or the Times, you can't call up Facebook and go, hey, what's my credibility rating and how do I improve it? And how does that impact where I fall on someone's newsfeed? And I think whether it's a company like Newsguard or our news, ours is just an attempt to try to produce, transparent versions of that. And, if I look at some of the work that we're doing sort of long-term, whether it's sort of within the remit of the online harms debate in the UK, or, some of the policy changes that are happening around the world. We have a tech hearing in the US today. I think long-term, the idea, or our hope at least, is that there will be greater collaboration between the tech platforms and the different approaches that exist out there. So that users have more control over their information ecosystem, so they can start to control, what type of content is surfaced on their social media feeds based on what parameters. There's a very subtle shift that happened that many didn't notice when all the platforms decided to go from having your news feed or your Twitter feed go from just chronological to based on, an algorithm. It actually does make an editorial decision where it prioritizes clicks and attention and outreach over trustworthy, credible content. And that is in itself an editorial decision. It's just one that we don't really know much about. And when big platforms do make tweaks to those algorithms, they have huge impacts on the numbers of traffic going towards different sites. So, whether it's Newsguard or our news, it's just an attempt to give back some of the power to publishers, to users, and level the playing field just a bit, so that it's not really just a monopoly over information, which currently does exist. The tech platforms do have a monopoly over communications. I think long-term, the idea would be that, users just have a bit more say over what they're seeing online and just more transparency into why they're seeing what they're seeing.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, isn't it? Because I do remember when the algorithms changed, and really that's what some of the challenges that we've got and that we've been also, touching on, is the echo chambers that get created on social media, that you only get served more of what you like. So, that's, just a massive challenge, because then you only see what you can see, and it leads to a very tunneled vision of what's going on in society, because of course I'm only getting one type of news that's filtered around my preferences. So I think it's a really brilliant point. I'm going to move on to another question, and this question is it's really more reflection, and it's directed at you, Kemi. The comment goes, mainstream media are often criticised for the lack of diverse voices and the lack of inclusive reporting. At the same time, a community seems to be best served by a dedicated outlet like Galdem that can focus coverage on its topics. And I just have to give you all just a quick reflection on we ran an event yesterday on Where Are All the Muslim Women, and we actually went to a few different news outlets to see if we could find some female Muslim journalists. One particular news outlet, didn't have anybody in their building, and it's a big mainstream publication. So I think it's so interesting seeing that the who makes the news shapes the news, that kind of philosophy. But I guess my question to you, Kemi, is: do you see there's going to be more of a rise in dedicated outlets like Galdem in the future if mainstream news isn't serving different communities?
Definitely. I think we're seeing a lot of independent publications popping up in the slipstream of Galdem. We now feel like the oldies in the space, because younger and younger generations, they have a very different approach to their beliefs. They really want to make things happen, and so there are publications like Aurelia popping up, and our peers at GWAP magazine and other like Muslim specific publications, or publications specifically for the trans community. It's sort of building a network of outlets that serve specific communities. I think it is great to see that, and it is nice to have a community, and we'd never see them in competition with us. We actually offer advertising space for free to our peers on Galdem, because we understand that our platform is now quite large. So we're always trying to lift others up with us as we go along. It is good to have specialized content, and it's also not new for there to be specialized content in journalism. There's magazines for people who love horses, or there's always been specialist topics that are covered best by niche publications. I think when it comes to news journalism and journalism that serves minority ethnics, women, and other groups, it is good if places that already have an established readership, who already have the resources, and who already have there's a lot of prestige around these titles, even though we all know that they aren't very good at telling the truth sometimes. There's still a lot of prestige around the massive newspapers that exclude us. So ideally it would be great if somewhere down the line they really looked at how they speak about minorities, because they have the biggest impact. When we're talking about the news agenda, and when we're responding to news, we're often responding to the agenda that they've set, which is a huge gripe of mine, because by the time you're reacting to the news points of the day, you're already reacting to something that somebody else has told you is important. But with a lack of Black journalists and a lack of people from our backgrounds, how do we get to say what is important? Things like, the Windrush scandal. We knew that was happening because that was happening to us, but it didn't become massive until The Guardian could set that agenda. But if only we had, the same resources and the same audience. Like, we're growing, but we're not anywhere near as big as the Titans in the rest of the game. So it's definitely, we need both. We definitely need mainstream media to be a bit more conscious of it as well.
I just say I agree with that. I think we need both, and I think we will see more specialist media, and it's partly driven by the changes in the business model. So I think that some media companies like the BBC or the Guardian will still try to reach out across different communities, and others will really try and make their business model about building deeper communities with specific groups, often based on membership models. And I think the sort of combination of those could be quite powerful. But I think the membership model is also potentially pushing us towards more sort of media echo chambers. You know, you're creating content that you know your members are going to like. And I think the challenge for those media companies is, you know, how do you also make sure that those views are challenged and that there's a good diversity within those specialisms, if you see what I mean.
That is very interesting, actually, because yeah, once you have a bunch of people who are paying you, you do want to please them, and like we do have to, we do want to understand what it is that they came for and what it is that they want to see in future. I suppose the thing with the membership model is that it kind of links to what we were saying before about Facebook's algorithm changing, and just that there needs to be a reason for somebody to get up in the morning and like put in galdem.com rather than go on Facebook and then just wait for the news to wash over them. And usually if somebody has paid money, they're more likely to just come and see what you've got going on that day, rather than, you know, waiting for the algorithm to decide what they should and shouldn't see. But yeah, there definitely will be, we do have a duty to not just feed them what they expect to see, but also what we want to produce as well, and what we think other publications should be producing.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to do one wrap-up question, and I'm going to get an answer off all of you. So the question actually comes through from Dilip, and the question is, his comment actually is, what resonates for me is the commitment to honest journalism. How can we encourage the publishing industry, the tech companies, and perhaps the government to deliver positive change? So it would be really good to hear from each of you what positive change and action, or what that could look like, what that could feel like. And I'm going to start with you, Rebecca. What's your best thinking on this question?
For me, I think it's about investing in journalists. I think there's been a real hollowing out of local newsrooms and national newsrooms to some extent over the years, and you really need to start there with well-trained journalists that are representative of the communities that they serve, and also, you know, to be the change you want to be. So at the BMJ, we have a set of ethical editorial principles. We have an ethics advisory committee, and we developed our own code of conduct for journalism. And we're also engaged in a long-term effort to be free of industry influence, for example, banning formula milk advertising in the journal. So sort of, you know, actually not being afraid to be quite activists in a space as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Nick, over to you.
Big question. I think, you know, I mean, I could talk about publishers and the things that publishers should do, and we've discussed much of this. You know, it's about diversity, it's about improving standards, it's about accuracy, it's about avoiding the mistakes of the past. It's about, you know, really responsible journalism, investigating, exposing false information, all of those kind of things journalism can do better. But I think on its own, that won't be enough. You know, I think also, you know, the platforms need to do a much better job, and journalists need to really pressure platforms to do a better job in terms of promoting quality news and really trying to come up with ways of giving people stuff that is relevant and not just popular, and really valuable to them. And I think also governments have a duty to act, to provide more clarity on content that is harmful and what platforms should do about that content, but not necessarily illegal. And obviously we do have sort of legislation pending, but we need to get to a place where the rules are clearer, where the platforms know what they have to do. And we do those two things, basically. We improve the quality of journalism, mainstream journalism and specialist journalism, at the same time as improving the quality of information within the platforms that people are obviously going to use and still love.
So we've heard from Rebecca about investing in quality journalists, investing in quality platforms and content. Over to you, Riyad. What's your thinking?
I think it's a very difficult topic to tackle, because while producing higher quality content and using journalists who are not biased, having news publications that have no political agendas or influence, it is all very much, you know, stepping in the right direction. It doesn't remove that subjectivity from the consuming public. And ultimately, the issue we have right now is, even with something like Newsguard, which is really important, what they're doing is incredibly important. For a huge swathe of consumers out there, that will just be seen as another way of their voices being silenced. It will be seen as another reason not to believe mainstream media, whether it's true or not, because it doesn't align with their agenda, and it also almost does align with their worldview that they're being put upon and they're being ignored, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a far more difficult, a far more nuanced problem than simply producing better quality content that's been fact-checked, that has no political bias, because how do we convince people to then accept that? You know, as we stand, unfortunately, you know, however we like to think of ourselves, whether it's enlightened liberals or what have you, unfortunately, the usual response we have to the other pole of opinion is to almost ridicule people for those beliefs, for not seeing the truth or what have you. That's not solving anything. That's not making, you know, 70 million Trump supporters believe what we know to be true. It's just making them hate us more for not believing what they believe. So, I mean, I wouldn't know where to start right now, because, you know, we could reshape mainstream media to have no political affiliations, no, you know, agendas, be completely transparent and make sure every story is 100% fact checked. That doesn't mean that a huge proportion of the population isn't going to ignore it.
Over to you, Anna Sophie.
Yeah, so I think I totally agree. Newsguard is not the end-all be-all solution. I think that the best thing that we can all do right now is, on all of our different social media accounts, to go and follow 10 news outlets that you vehemently disagree with, so that when you log on, you're not just seeing news that you know that you're already going to agree with, but you actually will see the news as it's presented by the other side. And I have to say, one thing that has really benefited me, I think, over the last 3 years, and everyone that works at Newsguard, is that I have to actually spend a lot of time reading news and speaking to people who run news outlets whose views I don't necessarily agree with. And I think part of the issue is that over the last couple of decades, our news and information ecosystems are essentially created to present different versions of reality for every single person when they log on. And you see this, right? When I go and follow a bunch of anti-vax accounts, and then Facebook says, okay, here's a couple anti-maskers and anti-lockdown and COVID is a hoax people. And all of a sudden, logging on in the morning, I can completely see how someone thinks the government has made up coronavirus and is using it to take away our freedoms and is killing us with 5G towers. And if that's what you see day after day, and you're conversing with people who believe the same thing, that becomes your version of reality. The thing that Newsguard is also trying to do, besides empower consumers, is that we're doing loads of research and producing reports on the ways in which the platforms are, from a product design perspective, actually prioritize misinformation over credible news. And we can see sort of in the 6 months leading up to the Capitol riots that if you wanted to get as much engagement as possible on Facebook, your best bet was to be publishing far-right misinformation. Far-right misinformation outperformed far-right credible information, which outperformed all other types. And I think to solve the problem, I think we cannot be afraid, and by we, I mean the industry, but also governments cannot be afraid to take on the platforms in a way that challenges their underlying business model. And I think when we look at something like the UK's online harms bill and changes in the US, it will all be window dressing if we do not approach the underlying issues at stake, which is that there are platforms who are currently profiting off of the spreading of misinformation and divisive content over what we would consider to be, you know, credible, authoritative content, especially when it comes to issues like democracy and a coronavirus pandemic.
Ria's put in the chat box, really good point, Anna Sophie. Exposing ourselves to diverse media outlets is just absolutely just so important, and seeing different people's points of view is just so important as well, rather than getting, you know, caught up in our own silos. Kemi, over to you, and we'll just have one last sort of thought and reflection from you.
I just wanted to pick up on what Rebecca said about investment, because that is a huge point, especially for us as a small organisation. The quality of our work only improves the more we can actually just like do the work, because it's our full-time job, and that's the main change we've been able to see. And journalists are time poor, which means that sometimes they aggregate news stories without even thinking about you know, whether it's true. It's just something that is everywhere, and so that's how you see fake stories get like published again and again on online ads. And I've seen that happen in real time, just because people are too stressed out to check whether something is actually true in my other jobs. And I was also thinking from a Ghanaian perspective for the answer to this question. Sometimes it's really good to understand the issues within your bubble and the role that you play, because, you know, sometimes there are things that we do disagree with our readers. For example, you mentioned anti-vaxxing, Anna, and like vaccine hesitancy is huge in our community, but not necessarily something that every single editor agrees with. So it's like thinking about how we can constantly learn and think about how we can be of value and present information to them that is balanced, that they might not be getting through, you know, WhatsApp conversations, where a lot of this anti-vax sentiment seems to be spreading in Black communities. And that's something that we do to try and, like, you know, readdress lack of truth in our community. And just having a mission and values that underpins our work, like transparency and accountability, and holding our hands up when we get things wrong, and also listening when our readers shout at us, as they often like to do. If there's something that has, you know, upset people, we'll try and think about why that is, and we'll try and think about how we can do better next time. And yeah, we just all get into this game because we're curious people. So if what we want is, you know, a truthful, balanced industry, then constantly upskilling and constantly, you know, thinking about how to improve is kind of crucial. Otherwise, why do we even bother going through this? It's not a particularly relaxing industry.
Well, look, I have found this the most exciting, inspiring, and thought-provoking conversation. I know our listeners have as well. I can hear an echo of myself, but never mind. And it's we're just also all watching dawn break over in the States. It's looking beautiful out there today. So thank you so much for joining us. And look, a massive thank you to the panelists. You've all just, you know, like I said, given us some great insights and fantastic things to be thinking about on a Thursday morning as we go out of lockdown. And I think, you know, so many actions, so many takeaways, so many things to do. And obviously, everybody should be downloading and using Newsguard. Everyone should be definitely going to look at Galdem, the BMJ, for their sources. Riyad, thank you for all your comments on content. And Nic, thank you for all your great insights. So it's been just a really thought-provoking and brilliant session this morning. I'm going to pass back to Chloe to close today. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you all of you. That was absolutely incredible. What a lot of content to take in. What a lot of conversations have been arisen, I suppose, from this too, because there's lots of considerations for all of us. You're all playing a hugely important part in that, and in the dialogue and addressing it this morning, but also in the work that you're all doing and will be doing as you move on through this navigation of COVID times and our reintroduction as a society as we start to mix again. And I think that just really sums up really nicely, Ali, how you kind of pivoted around all this change that we've had to deal with, but also how do we recognise what our communities are looking for, how we can help inform and prove the value of the environments that we're discussing and that we work across. So thank you all for joining us. I do want to just remind everybody that is still with us, because we have had a lot of attendees this morning, that we are having our second crunch of the year on the 29th of April, which is almost a continuation of this conversation, really looking about how we can solve ethics to solve programmatic. So please do join us for that, and we're absolutely really asking for your input on that and direction for how we explore that as well. So yeah, thank you all. Have a really great day, and yeah, good morning. Sorry, it's so early for you. Amazing to see that backdrop. And yeah, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to speak with you soon.